the industry that made the modern world possible, has destroyed more investor wealth than almost any other in history. In the winter of 1903, on a sand flat outside Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics achieved something the world's best-funded engineers had spent years failing to do. Their names were Orville and Wilbur Wright. Their aircraft stayed in the air for 12 seconds. Nobody standing in that field had the vocabulary yet for what had just been priced into the next century. The first commercial airline service arrived 10 years later, in January 1914, when a man named Tony Janus flew a single paying passenger across Tampa Bay in Florida for $5. The route lasted 4 months. The city of St. Petersburg had funded it as a civic experiment, not as a business, because no private investor yet believed the arithmetic could work. What followed was not revolution but infrastructure. A decade of barnstormers, military surplus aircraft, and government mail contracts quietly assembled the network that private capital had not yet found a reason to build on its own. Pilots flew war surplus biplanes between small-town fields, carrying letters because passengers alone could not cover fuel and repairs. The Air Mail Act of 1925 handed delivery routes to private carriers. The money that came with those contracts transformed scattered operations into companies. By the early 1930s, airlines like United, American, and TWA were flying schedules across the United States, and KLM and Lufthansa were building equivalent networks across Europe. The business was not yet profitable at scale. It was growing because governments wanted it to grow, and because the men running it believed, with a conviction that occasionally bordered on mania, that it would be. Juan Trippi believed it more than anyone alive. In 1927, the same year Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic solo and proved the ocean could be beaten, Trippi founded Pan American World Airways from a small office in Florida. Pan Am's first route ran to Havana. By 1939, its flying boats were crossing the Pacific, refueling on remote atolls that Trippi's own surveyors had scouted from the deck of a chartered ship. Trippi did not think of himself as running a transportation business. He believed he was dismantling the economic privilege of distance, and he ran Pan Am accordingly, often signing deals with foreign governments before his own board had approved the capital. By the mid-1960s, he had begun meeting privately with Bill Allen, the chief executive of Boeing, about an idea that the rest of the industry considered financially reckless. He wanted a commercial aircraft twice the size of anything then in service. He believed lower seat costs at higher capacity would do to transatlantic travel what the railroads had done to the American interior century earlier. Pan Am placed an order for 25 Boeing 747s before the aircraft had completed its design. Allen authorized the construction of the world's largest building in Everett, Washington, to have room to assemble them. Both men told their boards privately that the deal could destroy their companies if the plane failed to perform. The 747 made its first commercial flight in January 1970. It did not fail. Seat per mile costs dropped as capacity rose, and, for the first time in commercial aviation history, a middle-class family could buy a transatlantic ticket at a price that did not require a month's salary. In 1960, commercial airlines globally had carried roughly 38 million passengers. By 1978, U.S. carriers alone were moving over 275 million a year. The trajectory looked irreversible. Alfred Kahn thought it could still go faster. President Carter appointed the economist to chair the Civil Aeronautics Board in 1977. Fares were set by regulators. Routes were allocated by government committee. Competition was managed rather than permitted, and a new airline could not simply decide to fly a route. It had to petition for the right. Kahn argued that removing those structures would produce lower fares than any regulator had ever achieved on its own. The Airline Deregulation Act was signed in 1978 against sustained industry opposition that came as much from the airlines as from their unions, both of which had built their entire economics around a protected market. Within 5 years, the average domestic airfare had fallen by roughly half in real terms, compressing a coast-to-coast ticket from the equivalent of $1,400 to under $300. Southwest Airlines had seen this coming. It had been operating short-haul routes across Texas since 1971 on a stripped-down model the major carriers had dismissed as a regional oddity, and now it had a template the entire industry would spend the next 4 decades trying to replicate or survive. Stopped adding up. Then the first break came not from competition, but from the night sky above Scotland. On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the town of Lockerbie. 270 people were killed. A bomb had been concealed in the cargo hold. Libyan intelligence operatives were eventually held responsible. Pan Am was found legally liable for security failures, and the resulting settlements ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The damage compounded what was already a structural collapse. Pan Am had never fully recovered from the 1973 oil shock, which had briefly quadrupled fuel prices and exposed how thin aviation's margins actually were. Deregulation's price competition had then stripped away the fair floors that had cushioned that exposure. Lockerbie did not kill Pan Am. It removed what was left. The airline filed for bankruptcy in January 1991. Its final commercial flight departed on December 4 of that year. The company that had ordered the 747 pioneered Trans-Pacific service and put its name on a building above Grand Central Terminal, ceased operations with roughly 24,000 employees and no buyer for the whole. What came next made Lockerbie look like preparation. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the federal government grounded the entire American commercial fleet. The shutdown lasted 3 days. Passenger traffic did not return to pre-attack levels for years. United Airlines filed for bankruptcy. Delta filed. U.S. Airways filed twice. The industry absorbed an estimated $55 billion in losses in the years that followed. And because the underlying cost structure of commercial aviation had never actually been fixed, only temporarily covered by the long traffic growth of the 1990s, every external shock reopened the same wound in the same place. The 2008 financial crisis arrived before the sector had rebuilt any meaningful reserve. Oil prices spiked to historic levels in the same year. By 2013, American had absorbed U.S. Airways, United had merged with Continental, and Delta had taken Northwest, leaving 4 carriers in control of roughly 80% of domestic U.S. capacity. The consolidation looked like stability, because for the first time in decades, no single carrier's failure could take the whole industry down with it. What arrived instead was a virus. In January 2020, the International Air Transport Association had projected a 5th consecutive year of industry profit. By April, 90% of the world's commercial fleet was parked on runways and desert storage lots, aircraft nose to tail on tarmac built for parking spots, not permanent storage. Revenue fell by 60% in a single year. The industry recorded net losses of approximately $137 billion in 2020 alone. It's so simple you can draw it on a napkin. Governments worldwide injected an estimated $200 billion or more to prevent the sector from dissolving entirely. The intervention carried an admission that had been implicit for decades. Aviation had become infrastructure that happened to be structured as private enterprise, and no government could afford the cost of letting it disappear. The industry has since recovered its passenger numbers. The International Air Transport Association reported 4.3 billion passengers in 2023, approaching 2019 levels. Net profit has returned, though it remains concentrated at the top of the market, with a handful of carriers capturing most of the industry's total balancing, while dozens of smaller operators still lose money on every seat they sell. Fuel still accounts for between 20 and 30% of operating costs. Labor costs are rising as pandemic-era concession unwind through contract negotiations. The structural pressure that Alfred Kahn's deregulation installed in 1978, lower fares, higher volume, margins compressed to their minimum, has not eased. The next disruption is already in the regulatory calendar. Aviation accounts for roughly 2.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions. The European Union has mandated its sustainable aviation fuel blends from 2025, scaling to 70% of total fuel volume by 2050. That cost has not been absorbed into any carrier's current projections. Electric short-haul aircraft are moving through airworthiness certification, years behind the timelines their manufacturers first promised investors. In 1903, Orville Wright's first flight lasted 12 seconds and proved nothing about profit. In 2023, the average commercial airline seat generated approximately $11 in net income. The math has never worked cleanly. The planes have never stopped.